The war that the United States and Israel initiated against Iran continues to drag on, and as the days pass, the strategy of both sides in this war is becoming clearer and clearer. The US and Israel initially thought they could win a quick and easy war by carrying out decapitation strikes and eliminating all of the top military and political leaders of Iran. And Donald Trump assumed that it would be a quick and easy operation like his invasion of Venezuela. And after eliminating all of the leaders, the US and Israel could put a puppet regime in Tehran and they could declare victory. However, that strategy obviously did not work. The Iranian government has shown itself to be much more resilient and able to replace their leaders. And now what we clearly see is a war of attrition in which both sides are prepared for a much longer war in which they try to slowly attack each other and grind down each other's capacities until one side gives in. So now what the US military is doing is just brutally bombing civilian areas in Iran, schools and hospitals and residential neighborhoods, simply to try to collapse Iranian society, to make people so desperate they beg for an end to the war. And US Secretary of War Pete Hegseth boasted proudly that, quote, "We are punching them while they're down." And it is certainly true that the US military is much more powerful than Iran's military, at least if you look at it at a kind of superficial level, simply looking at the number of planes and warships and aircraft carriers and missiles that the US has and compare it to Iran. So for instance, the US spends $1 trillion per year on its military, whereas Iran spends about $10 billion per year. So certainly it does look like the US is infinitely more powerful than Iran, and this should be easy, right? I mean, this is the arrogant view in Washington. However, the Iranian military is much more sophisticated than many of these war hawks in Washington assumed. And Iran has mastered the art of asymmetric warfare. Tehran always knew that it could never compete with the US in terms of number of missiles and advanced technology, but Iran recognized that the US still has major points of vulnerability that Iran could hit. And in this way, Iran is borrowing the tactics of the anti-colonial movements in the 20th century. Like, for instance, the National Liberation Front of South Vietnam, which waged an asymmetric guerrilla war against the US military. The US assumed that it could easily win a war against Vietnam, which was one of the poorest countries in the world. But at the end of the day, the US, despite all of its resources and all of its military power and technology, the US still lost that war. And Iran is implementing a very similar strategy today. And part of this strategy is what Iran refers to as its decentralized mosaic defense doctrine, in which the command structure of the Iranian military has been decentralized because Iranian military commanders know they're very likely going to be targeted by the US and Israel. So by decentralizing leadership and also by physically decentralizing the weapons and the soldiers, Iran can withstand the heavy bombardment of the US and Israel, and it's prepared to wage a much longer war of attrition. And obviously, Iran doesn't have the capacity to hit the continental United States on the other side of the world. So instead, Iran recognized that there are major points of vulnerability, and those include the energy markets, especially the global oil price, and the stock market. So Iran's strategy is to massively increase energy costs, to spike the price of oil, to cause an energy crisis that then unleashes an economic crisis and causes very high rates of inflation, and at the same time, to try to crash stock markets. So the US has previously been waging brutal economic war against Iran through the use of sanctions. Well, Iran is now giving the US a taste of its own medicine by implementing a kind of guerrilla economic warfare. And thus far, the strategy has been quite successful. The price of oil has nearly doubled. And how has Tehran accomplished this? Well, first of all, Tehran shut down the Strait of Hormuz, which is the most important oil transit choke point on Earth. It is right off the coast of Iran, and every day, 20% of the global oil supply flows through this very narrow strait. And as of the beginning of March, traffic through the Strait of Hormuz has grinded to a halt, and there are basically no ships traveling through the strait. But it's not just that. Iran has also targeted energy infrastructure in the Persian Gulf region. Now, almost all of the neighboring countries host U.S. military bases, and the U.S. military has used many of these bases in the Gulf region in order to attack Iran, which means these countries are parties to the conflict. Many of their governments claim that supposedly they're neutral. That's ridiculous. The U.S. is using their territory, and they're allowing the U.S. military to use bases on their territory in order to attack Iran. They are parties to the conflict. So Iran has retaliated, not only hitting the U.S. military bases in these neighboring countries, but also hitting some of the oil and gas infrastructure, which has caused significant damage. And many of these Persian Gulf monarchies, these dictatorships sponsored by the US, they've been forced to shut down oil and gas production. And this is not something that you can just turn off and on like a switch. Once Qatar shuts down gas production, once Saudi Arabia shuts down oil production, it's going to take many weeks, if not well over a month, to actually bring that production back to the previous levels. And this is why these US-backed Gulf dictatorships are freaking out. The US-backed monarchies are warning, as Qatar's energy minister warned in an article in the Financial Times, that this war could, quote, bring down the economies of the world, end quote. And the US-backed Qatari dictatorship estimated that the oil price could rise to $150 a barrel, which is well over double the initial price of $70 when the US and Israel launched this war of aggression. And this is going to have major economic consequences on countries all around the world, including the United States. And you know what Donald Trump's response has been? On his website, Truth Social, Trump insisted that skyrocketing oil prices are, quote, a very small price to pay, end quote. And then he added in all caps, only fools would think differently, end quote. Well, many working class Americans are going to feel very differently very soon because due to this US-Israeli war of aggression against Iran, as the global oil price has skyrocketed, naturally, the price of gasoline has also skyrocketed, and it nearly doubled from January until the beginning of March. And as the war continues, it's likely that gasoline prices will only continue to rise. And this is going to have massive shockwaves throughout the economy, because as the economist Isabella Weber has shown in her research, fossil fuel prices are the most important price for inflation and also inequality. When the price of energy skyrockets, everything else in the economy becomes more expensive. All of the other goods and services, because the food you buy at a supermarket has to be sent physically to the supermarket. It has to be transported, often in a big truck that uses a lot of gasoline. And imported goods have to be sent across the ocean on ships that use a lot of gasoline, or in planes that use a lot of gasoline. And the economist Isabella Weber has also shown in her research that this fuels inequality. The poorer you are, the larger share of income you spend on basic essentials, and the price of those essentials rises as gas prices go up. So this war of choice, this war of aggression that the US initiated against Iran is going to have massive negative repercussions, especially on working class people, including working class voters in the United States. And let's not forget that this year, in November 2026, there are midterm elections. And Americans are going to be very angry about Trump starting a totally unnecessary war of choice, which leads to an even worse affordability crisis in the US when many people can't afford housing and school and insurance. And now gas prices are skyrocketing, which means food prices are going to skyrocket. Inflation is going to pick up once again, despite the fact that Trump won the election in 2024, falsely claiming that he was going to bring down inflation. He's totally failed to do that. And as of the 9th of March, Trump's approval rating was just 38%, with 58% of Americans, nearly 3/5, opposing Trump. And it's likely that his approval ratings will continue to fall in the upcoming months as the midterm election nears in November. But that's not all. Adding to the major inflationary pressures of this war is the fact that many of the Persian Gulf countries are also key parts of the global supply chain for fertilizers. Many of them produce fertilizers, or they provide the inputs, the chemicals that are necessary to actually create fertilizer. This means that the US-Israeli war of aggression against Iran could cause a global food price shock because the global fertilizer supply chain is breaking down. And this is in addition to the very high costs of energy, of oil and natural gas due to this war. And this crisis has been immediately felt by the Persian Gulf monarchies surrounding Iran that are hosting US military bases and helping the US wage war against Iran. The UAE, for instance, is warning that Dubai could run out of food in just a few days because these Persian Gulf dictatorships sponsored by the US, they don't produce anything other than oil and natural gas and maybe some chemicals. They don't produce food. They import basically everything. And this US-Israeli war of aggression has caused a massive crisis. And if they can import anything, it's now extremely expensive because ships don't want to go anywhere near the Persian Gulf right now. And air traffic is also shutting down. Every few days, there is a new report that Dubai or another major city in the Gulf is shutting down their airport operations. And then, yes, maybe the next day or 2 days after, they resume operations. But the point is, it's very difficult to get a flight in or a flight out. And this is devastating the reputation of these Persian Gulf dictatorships that have marketed themselves, especially to rich expats from Western countries and rich people from the global South who leave their own home country because they don't want to pay taxes, and they relocate to countries like the UAE, and they support these Persian Gulf dictatorships that abuse migrant workers and treat them like modern day slaves. But these rich people don't care because they don't have to pay taxes and they live extreme lives of luxury. And it was assumed that it was so safe to live in the UAE or Saudi Arabia or these other Persian Gulf dictatorships. But we now see that was an illusion. These are proxy regimes of the US empire, and they host US military bases. Most of them support Israel and have done nothing to help the Palestinian people. And now they're facing consequences for helping the US wage a war of aggression against Iran. And this is why so many rich people, expats living in these countries, are freaking out and trying to find a way to leave. And this brings us to another major aspect of this war, which is the missile defense systems that not only Israel has, but also many of these Persian Gulf monarchies that they bought from the US. And Bloomberg published a very important article titled Iran's Missile Math, $20,000 drones take on $4 million Patriot missiles. This article noted that just 3 days into the war, it already became a battle of attrition, like the war in Ukraine, where both sides are trying to grind each other down. This article notes that waves of drone attacks by Iran are putting pressure on the defenses of the US and its partners from Bahrain to the UAE, depleting weapons stockpiles. As Bloomberg puts it, the outcome of the fight may depend on which side runs out of munitions first. And Bloomberg mentions a very important military technology called the Shahed 136 one-way attack drone. If you followed the war in Ukraine, you've probably heard of these because Iran has in fact provided the technology to Russia, and Russia is now actually developing its own modified forms of the Shahed drone. And drones have been a key part of the war in Ukraine. And today they're also a very important part of this Iranian war of self-defense against U.S.-Israeli aggression. So what is the Shahed 136 drone? This is a kamikaze drone. They carry explosives, and then they drive toward a target, and they explode. But the advantage of these kamikaze drones is, one, they're quite cheap to make. Iran makes them for estimates of between 10,000 and 30,000 US dollars, an average of 20,000 US dollars, which is significantly cheaper than a missile, especially the interceptors used in these US missile defense systems provided by big companies like Raytheon and Lockheed Martin. And these drones are very small. They're about 2.5 meters by 3.5 meters. So Iran has been able to make many thousands of these Shahed drones, and it's likely that Iran, as we speak, is making more and more. It's not just that Iran had a stockpile preparing for the war. As the war continues, it's likely that Iran is going to make more and more, so Iran can maintain this war of attrition at a time when the US and its proxies in the region are actually running out of missile interceptors.